At 7:29 a.m. on December 14th, 1944, Private Frank Callahan broke 3 regulations in the U.S. Army Sniper Manual. By 11:47 a.m., he would break 11 more and save 40 American lives. His court-martial would begin exactly 63 days later. But first he had to kill a man no one else could see. Frank pressed his body into frozen mud beneath a fallen oak tree in Belgium's Hürtgen forest. The gap between trunk and ground measured 6 inches. Just enough. German machine gun fire tore through branches 6 feet above his head. The sound was enormous, a ripping canvas of death that made the air vibrate. His platoon was pinned down 200 yards behind him, bleeding out in the snow. Through his Springfield scope, Frank tracked 3 German soldiers advancing through the undergrowth. They moved fast, professional, using the MG-42 covering fire to close distance. The lead soldier carried a Kar 98K rifle at the ready field, gray uniform, dark against white snow. 180 yards out, moving left to right, wind negligible in the dense forest. Frank centered the crosshairs on the German's chest. His finger found the trigger. Cold metal. 4 pounds of pressure required. He breathed out slowly, watching his breath fog in the freezing air. Then squeezed. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, trapped between his body and frozen ground. The sound was enormous in the confined space under the log. Cordite smoke, sharp and acrid. The German soldier dropped instantly, face first into the snow. His rifle clattered against a tree root. The other 2 Germans froze. They scanned the tree-lined weapons up, searching, looking up at the canopy, looking left and right at the ridgelines. They had no idea where death had come from, because they weren't looking down. Nobody looked down. Frank worked the bolt. The spent casing ejected, bounced off the underside of the oak log, landed in the mud beside his face. Still hot, melting the snow it touched. He chambered another round. The metallic click was quiet but definite. Final. His radio crackled, Captain Whitmore's voice tight with stress. "Callahan, where the hell are you?" Frank keyed the radio voice low. "Ground level, sir. Under a log." Silence on the radio. 3 seconds. 5. "Say again." "They can't see me, sir. I'm part of the forest floor." Another pause. Then Whitmore's voice, quieter now. "Jesus Christ. Callahan." Frank was lying where no American sniper was supposed to be. In 4 hours, he would prove the U.S. Army had trained 10,000 snipers wrong. But the cost would follow him for 44 years. To understand how Frank Callahan became invisible, we need to go back. To a childhood spent hunting deer in the Berkshire Mountains. To 3 friends who died following the manual. And to a German sniper who taught Frank the deadliest lesson of the war. 71 days earlier. Frank Callahan was born in March 1922 in South Boston, 3 blocks from the harbor, where his father worked the docks, Irish Catholic neighborhood. Row houses pressed together like books on a shelf. Narrow streets where backing down meant getting your face split open. His mother died when he was 13. Tuberculosis, the kind that hollowed you out slowly while the family watched. Patrick Callahan, Frank's father, loaded cargo ships bound for Europe. 12-hour days for $18 a week. It wasn't enough, not for 4 kids. Frank was the oldest. Tommy 11, Mary 9, Sean 6. When their mother died, Frank became the second parent. He quit school at 15 and went to work at Bethlehem Steel, riveting destroyer hulls alongside men twice his age. The work was brutal, hot metal and cold wind, hands that bled through gloves. But it taught Frank patience, the kind of patience that would save lives in a Belgian forest 9 years later. You couldn't rush a rivet, couldn't rush a gun. You heated the gun, waited for the right temperature, placed it precisely, then pulled the trigger. Rush it and the hull would crack. Wait too long and the metal would cool. There was a moment you learned to feel it. Frank learned to see how things should work, not how they were told to work. At age 11, he fixed Mrs. O'Brien's radio when it died. She couldn't afford a new one, and the repair shop wanted $5. Frank took it apart on her kitchen table, found a loose wire, resoldered it with a nail heated on her stove. Cost her nothing. "How'd you know how to do that?" she asked. "Just made sense how it should work." At 14, he modified Uncle Sean's fishing reel that kept jamming. Filed down the gear teeth that were catching, smoothed the bearing with sandpaper and oil. When he handed it back, Sean cast it across the Charles River. "Works better than when I bought it, Frankie." It was fighting itself, just needed to cooperate. At 16, Frank jury-rigged a broken rivet gun at the shipyard. The supervisor was ready to scrap it. Overheating, they said, worthless. Frank redirected the coolant flow with bent copper tubing he found in the scrap bin. The foreman watched him work for 10 minutes, said nothing. Then when the gun ran cool for an hour straight, he clapped Frank on the shoulder. Kid's got a knack, sees how things should work, not how they're told to work. Patrick Callahan told Frank something the night before he shipped out to basic training. They sat on the front steps, March cold, both of them in work coats. Your mother had that gift too, Frankie. She could look at anything broken and see what it needed to be whole again. Army's gonna want to make you follow their way, but sometimes their way ain't the right way. You remember that? Frank remembered, but the most important education came in November. Every November, Uncle Sean took Frank deer hunting in the Berkshire Mountains. Not for sport, for meat. The family needed it. Patrick's $18 a week bought rent and potatoes. Meat was extra. Meat was November. Frank was 8 years old the first time Uncle Sean handed him a rifle. A Winchester Model 70. Bolt action, scope mounted, heavy in small hands. Deer don't look up, Frankie. They look across. Horizontal threats. You climb a tree, you're a silhouette against the sky. You stay on the forest floor, you're just another shadow. They would walk into the Berkshires before dawn, find a spot where deer trails converged and wait. Not in trees, on the ground. Uncle Sean would position Frank behind a fallen log or in a natural depression in the earth, cover him with branches and dead leaves, and tell him not to move. For hours, sometimes 6-7 hours without moving. Predators scan horizontal, Frankie. They look at eye level and above. They don't look down, because nothing dangerous comes from below. You stay low, stay still, you're invisible. Frank was 16 the day he understood completely. They'd been waiting 4 hours behind a brush pile. Cold November rain. Frank's hands were numb. His back ached. His knees screamed. A 10-point buck walked past them. 40 yards away, stopped, turned its head, looked directly at their position. Frank didn't breathe. The deer stared. 30 seconds. 45. Then it lowered its head and continued walking, passed within 20 feet of them. Never spooked, never ran, just walked past calm and unafraid because it never saw them. Uncle Sean whispered after the deer was gone. Most men can't do that, Frankie. Stay that still that long. You got something different. You got patience. Real patience. That's worth more than quick hands or sharp eyes. Frank shot that buck 2 hours later when it bedded down in a hollow. One shot, 120 yards. Through the heart. It died without knowing what happened. Uncle Sean Field dressed it while Frank watched. They carried it out together, 60 pounds of venison split between them. 8 years, 11 deer, 0 misses over 100 yards. Frank didn't know it, but that patience learned waiting for an 8-point buck in 1938 would save 40 American soldiers in a Belgian forest in 1944 and get him court-martialed for it. The draft notice came in March 1943. Fort Benning, Georgia. Infantry training. Frank qualified expert with the M1 Garand. 238 points out of 250. The range sergeant pulled him aside after qualification. Callahan, you hunt. Yes, Sergeant. You should be a sniper. Yes, Sergeant. But we got enough snipers. Need bodies for the line. So Frank went to Europe as a replacement. Company B, 110th Infantry Regiment, 28th Division. He arrived in October 1944, just in time for the Hürtgen. The Hürtgen forest was where American infantry went to die. 50 square miles of the densest woodland in Europe, straddling the German-Belgian border. Visibility dropped to 30 yards in the canopy gloom. Trees exploded from artillery, sending wooden shrapnel down like javelins that killed men in foxholes. German pillboxes invisible until you were dead controlled every approach. Between September and December 1944, the forest consumed 33,000 Americans. The 28th Infantry Division lost 6,184 men in 3 weeks. The forest didn't care about tactics or training or courage. It just killed. Frank arrived on November 3, 1944. Cold rain turning to sleet, mud that sucked boots off feet. He was assigned to 2nd Platoon Charlie Squad. The men looked at him with the blank faces of soldiers who'd learned not to remember new replacements' names because replacements died, usually within a week. That first night, German artillery hit their position. Tree bursts. The shells exploded in the canopy and sent splinters raining down. Private Miller, who had the bunk next to Frank, took a 6-inch piece of pine through his throat. He drowned in his own blood while they tried to dig him out of his collapsed foxhole. Took him 4 minutes to die. Frank held pressure on the wound. Blood pumped through his fingers, hot despite the November cold. Miller's eyes stayed open the whole time, watching Frank asking a question Frank couldn't answer. Welcome to the Hürtgen. American Sniper Doctrine was clear. Field Manual 2310 Sniper Training and Employment, published 1943. The sniper should seek elevated positions that provide observation over the maximum area of the battlefield. Elevated positions, high ground, clear sight lines, maximum range. The theory made sense on a rifle range at Fort Benning. In the Hürtgen, it was suicide. Frank watched men die following that doctrine. Private Vincent Hayes died first. Hayes was 21 years old from a farm outside Des Moines, Iowa. Talked about his fiancée Linda constantly. Showed everyone the photograph he kept in his helmet. Linda, in a yellow dress, standing in a wheat field, squinting against the sun. Pretty girl. Big smile. Hayes said they were getting married in June right after his rotation. He was going to start a crop dusting business. Buy a Stearman biplane, teach himself to fly spray pesticide over Iowa farmland. Hayes had it all planned out. On November 6, German artillery hit their position at 3 in the morning. Frank and Hayes shared a foxhole pressed together in frozen mud while the world exploded around them. The concussion from each shell made their teeth rattle. Dirt rained down, the smell of cordite and torn earth. Hayes talked through it, voice shaking but steady. We're going to have kids, Frank. 3 of them. Linda wants 3. 2 boys and a girl, she says, but I told her we'll take whatever God gives us. And I'm going to teach them to fly Frank. All 3. Soon as they're big enough to see over the instrument panel. Nothing better than flying Frank. Nothing better than being up there free. Frank just listened. He wasn't much of a talker. Never had been. But he liked Hayes. The kid had hope. That was rare in the Hürtgen. The barrage lasted 40 minutes. When it stopped, they climbed out of the foxhole. Hayes showed Frank the photo again. Linda in the yellow dress. 17 days until rotation, Frank. 17 days and I'm home. 2 days later, on November 8th at 9:30 in the morning, Captain Reeves needed someone to climb a tree and establish an observation post. German movement reported north of their position. Someone had to spot for the mortars. Hayes volunteered. I'll do it, sir. 17 days left. Time to earn my keep. Frank watched Hayes climb a pine tree 20 feet up. Careful professional, using the branches like ladder rungs. Hayes settled into position, wrapped his left arm around the trunk for stability, raised his binoculars. 9:47 a.m. Frank checked his watch later. The shot came from somewhere north, maybe 200 yards, maybe 250. Impossible to tell in the forest. The German round hit Hayes just left of his sternum, center mass. Hayes made a small sound, not a scream, more like surprise, like someone had pushed him unexpectedly. The binoculars fell first. They tumbled down through the branches, hitting wood with sharp cracks, glass shattering when they hit the ground. Then Hayes fell. His body was loose arms, wide legs tangled in branches. He hit 3 branches on the way down. Crack, crack, crack. Each impact snapped him in a different direction. He landed in the snow 6 feet from where Frank was standing. On his back, eyes open, and the photograph of Linda in the yellow dress was in his chest pocket, soaking up Hayes's blood, turning from yellow to dark red to black. Frank dropped to his knees, pressed both hands on the chest wound. Blood pumped between his fingers, hot, rhythmic. Hayes looked at him. His mouth moved. Tell Linda. Then nothing. His eyes were still open, but they were empty, like someone had turned off a light behind them. Frank sat there holding Hayes's body for 30 seconds. A minute. Someone pulled him away. Probably the medic. Frank didn't remember. The German sniper never fired again. They searched for him for 2 hours, never found him, never even spotted his position. But Frank understood something sitting there with Hayes's blood soaking into his uniform. The German had shot from ground level, somewhere in the undergrowth, maybe 200 yards out. Perfect concealment, minimal visibility. Hayes had been visible in that tree against the gray sky, even through branches. The German on the ground was just another shadow. That night, Frank lay in his foxhole staring at the black silhouette of tree branches against the sky. He thought about deer bedded down in low brush under fallen trees and natural depressions where the ground concealed them. They didn't climb to safety. They sank into it. Predators looked for movement at eye level and above. They didn't look down. What if a man could do the same thing? Frank didn't know it yet, but Hayes's death would teach him the most important lesson of the war, the lesson that would save 40 lives, and the lesson the Army would marshal him for learning. Corporal Samuel Briggs died 11 days later. Briggs was 24, a machinist from Detroit who'd worked the auto plants before the war. Precision work. Tolerance is measured in thousandths of an inch. He brought that precision to infantry work. Briggs taught Frank how to clean his rifle in the rain. Oil freezes up here, Callahan. You gotta use the tricks. Cosmoline mixed with kerosene 2 parts to 1 keeps it liquid down to 10 degrees. Frank watched Briggs field strip his M1 in 40 seconds flat, even wearing gloves. Briggs had 2 years of combat experience. North Africa, Sicily, Salerno. He should have known better. On November 19th, Briggs positioned himself on a ridgeline overlooking a crossroads the Germans were using for resupply. Textbook position, 360-degree visibility for 400 yards. Clear fields of fire. Exactly what the manual prescribed. He killed 2 Germans in the first 30 minutes. Clean shots. Professional. The German counter-sniper spotted him within 90 minutes. At 10:15 a.m., 3 mortar rounds bracketed Briggs' position. The 3rd round was close enough. Shrapnel caught him in the throat. Arterial spray bright red mist in the cold air. Briggs clutched his throat with both hands, but there was nothing to hold. The carotid was severed. He drowned in his own blood in 90 seconds. The medic reached him in 2 minutes. Too late. Way too late. Frank had been 50 yards away, prone behind a fallen log, watching Briggs work. When the mortars came in, Frank pressed himself flat and waited. After the 3rd round, silence. Then someone screaming for a medic. Frank knew before he looked. Elevated position, maximum visibility, just like the manual said. And Briggs was dead. Sergeant Thomas Morrison died 8 days after that. Morrison was 29, a logger from Montana who'd spent 10 years in the woods before the war. 5 years of combat experience. North Africa, Sicily, 2 campaigns in Italy. He'd seen everything, survived everything. Morrison mentored Frank during those first weeks in the Hürtgen. You got the patience, kid. That's 90% of sniping. The other 10% is just not being stupid. On November 27th, Morrison used a blown-out farmhouse as a sniper nest. 2nd floor western window. Perfect field of fire overlooking a German supply route. He killed 3 Germans in 40 minutes. Then a Panzerfaust team spotted his position. At 2:33 p.m., a rocket hit the building. The entire 2nd floor collapsed in a fireball of timber and masonry. They found Morrison's rifle in the rubble the next day. Stock burned, barrel bent from the heat. They never found enough of Morrison to bury. Just his dog tags melted into an unreadable lump of metal. Frank thought about all 3 deaths that night. Hayes shot from a tree. Briggs shot from a ridgeline. Morrison killed in an elevated building. All of them following doctrine. All of them in elevated positions with maximum visibility. All of them dead. The pattern was clear. The problem wasn't the men. They were good soldiers. Careful professional experience. The problem was the doctrine. The manual was wrong. On December 2nd, Frank watched a 4th man die. Staff Sergeant William Peterson was 32 years old, a logger from Oregon who should have known better. 18 months of combat. He'd survived longer than most. That morning, Peterson positioned himself 20 feet up in an oak tree, trying to spot German movement near a contested road junction. Frank was 50 yards away, prone behind a fallen log, just resting, watching. At 2:17 p.m., Frank heard the shot, saw Peterson's head snap back. The German round hit him in the left eye socket. No scream, just silence. Peterson dropped his rifle. The Springfield tumbled down through the branches with that distinctive wooden clatter. His body followed, loose heavy hitting 3 branches on the way down. He landed in a twisted heap 15 feet from Frank. Frank didn't move. Smart. The sniper was still active. Frank lay absolutely motionless for 3 hours watching the tree line, waiting for another shot, trying to spot the German position. He never saw movement, never heard anything, never identified the hide. But Frank was good at tracking angles. 8 years of deer hunting taught you to read trajectory, estimate distance from sound. The shot had come from ground level, approximately 200 yards north, through the undergrowth. Zero elevation. The German wasn't in a tree, wasn't on a ridge. He was on the forest floor somewhere in that dense tangle of brush and fallen timber. Perfectly concealed. Perfect concealment. Minimal visibility. Exactly the opposite of American doctrine. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in his foxhole staring up at the tree branches thinking about Hayes and Briggs and Morrison and Peterson, thinking about deer, thinking about Uncle Sean's voice. Deer don't look up, Frankie, they look across. The realization came slowly then, all at once. Germans had been fighting in forests since 1941. Birch woods outside Leningrad, pine forests of Poland, Ukrainian woodlands. 3 years of forest warfare. They'd learned what Americans hadn't. In dense woodland, elevation makes you visible. Height makes you a target. The Germans had adapted. Americans were still following a manual written for open terrain. Frank understood this instinctively because he'd spent 8 years hunting deer. And deer didn't look up. They looked across. Horizontal threats. Movement at eye level. A man in a tree was silhouetted against the sky, even through branches. A man on the ground was just another shadow among 10,000 shadows. But Field Manual 2310 was explicit. The sniper should seek elevated positions. The Army didn't train snipers to fight from ground level. They trained them to climb. Frank knew what he had to do. He also knew it could mean a court-martial. Article 92, failure to obey orders and regulations. Article 108, destruction or improper use of military property. Maximum sentence, 5 years hard labor. In a combat zone, possibly worse. But Hayes was dead. Briggs was dead. Morrison and Peterson were dead. All because they'd followed the manual. Frank Callahan was about to do something no American sniper had done in 3 years of war. He was about to prove that the U.S. Army had trained 10,000 snipers wrong. But first he needed permission from a captain who couldn't give it. On the morning of December 3rd, Frank found Captain Robert Whitmore at the company command post. Whitmore was 31 years old, a high school history teacher from Cleveland who'd been given a company to command after the previous CO took an MG-42 burst to the face on November 18th. Whitmore was trying to keep 187 men alive in a forest designed to kill them. He didn't have time for theory. Frank stood in the entrance to the dugout command post. Whitmore was studying a map by lantern light, making notes. "Sir, request a word." Whitmore didn't look up. "Make it quick, Callahan." "It's about the snipers, sir." Whitmore looked up. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. 3 weeks in command, 4 dead snipers, 38 dead riflemen. The numbers were crushing him. "What about them?" "They're dying because they're too high." Whitmore put down his pencil. "Elevated positions provide visibility, Callahan." "That's doctrine." "Doctrine's wrong for this terrain, sir. Germans are shooting from the forest floor. We're climbing trees and dying. You want to engage targets from ground level." Whitmore shook his head. "You'll have zero visibility." "I'll have concealment, sir. That matters more. Visibility doesn't help if you're dead." Whitmore studied him for a long moment. "The manual exists for a reason. Elevated positions, maximum observation, clear fields of fire." "The manual was written for open terrain, sir." Frank's voice was steady. Not arguing, just stating fact. "This isn't open terrain. This is 30-yard visibility and tree-burst artillery. Height doesn't help, it kills. You're a rifleman, Callahan, not a sniper." "Hayes was a rifleman too, sir. Briggs was a corporal. Morrison was a sergeant. Peterson had 18 months combat. They're all dead. I'm asking permission to try something different." Whitmore leaned back. The silence stretched out. Outside the dugout, someone was coughing. The wet, rattling cough of a man with pneumonia who couldn't get warm. "And if you get killed doing it, then you're down 1 rifleman instead of another sniper, sir. But if it works, and I authorized it, I'm condoning a violation of Field Manual 2310. If it works, and I didn't authorize it, you're court-martialed. Either way, someone's career ends. Frank said nothing, just waited. Whitmore picked up his pencil, looked back at his map. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. Why you, Callahan? Why not let someone else figure this out? Because Hayes talked to me about his fiancée, Linda, the night before he died, sir. He showed me her photo. Yellow dress? Wheat field? He had 17 days left, and I watched him bleed out in the snow because he followed the manual. I can't watch that happen again. Another long silence. Whitmore drew a circle on his map, erased it, drew it again. I didn't authorize this conversation. Clear. Clear, sir. Don't get caught. And Callahan, sir, don't miss, because if you miss, I never heard of you. But if you succeed, he paused. I still never heard of you. You understand? Yes, sir. Plausible deniability. Smart kid. Whitmore looked back at his map. Now get out of here before I change my mind. Captain Whitmore had just given Frank Callahan permission to commit a court-martial offense. Neither man spoke the words. Both men understood, and in 63 days, Whitmore would have to deny this conversation ever happened. Frank had permission he couldn't acknowledge to do something he couldn't admit that might save lives he couldn't guarantee. On December 12th, he found the perfect place to try. The fallen oak was massive, 60 feet long, blown over by artillery sometime in October. The root ball had torn free from the earth, creating a depression 15 feet across and 5 feet deep. The trunk had fallen at an angle, leaving a gap underneath. 14 inches of clearance between the massive trunk and frozen ground. Snow had drifted against the log, providing additional concealment. From 30 feet away, it looked like every other fallen tree in the Hürtgen forest. From 3 feet away, it still looked like every other fallen tree. Frank found it during an afternoon patrol on December 12th. He marked the location mentally. That evening after dark, he returned alone. He approached from the south, moving slowly, checking for German positions. Clear. He crawled underneath the oak on his elbows, dragging his rifle beside him. Tight fit. The frozen mud was hard enough to support his weight without leaving obvious impressions. The root ball created a natural backstop, blocking any silhouette. The trunk itself was 3 feet of solid oak. It would stop machine gun fire. Frank positioned himself facing north toward German lines. Through the gap between trunk and ground, he had a horizontal sight line. 6 inches of viewing angle. Barely enough. But it stretched for 200 yards through the forest. He could see the bases of trees, the undergrowth, the small rises and depressions in terrain. He couldn't see the sky. He couldn't see anything above 4 feet in height. Perfect. Frank spent 3 hours under that log on December 12th, not moving, just watching. At 4:20 p.m., a deer walked through the forest 90 yards out. It picked its way through the snow, browsing on whatever it could find. The deer passed within 50 yards of Frank's position. Never looked down. Just walked past, calm and unafraid, because it never saw him. Just another shadow. At 5:15 p.m., 2 German soldiers walked past, 40 feet from Frank's position. Close enough that Frank could hear them talking. He didn't understand German, but he heard the casual tone. They were relaxed, not expecting contact. One of them stopped 10 feet from Frank's log to light a cigarette. Took 3 tries in the wind. Finally got it lit. Took a long drag, blew smoke. The other soldier said something. They both laughed. The first soldier flicked his cigarette butt. It landed 6 feet from Frank, still glowing red in the gray twilight. Then they walked on. They never looked down. Frank understood in that moment. Men fight at eye level. Threats come from elevation, from trees, ridge lines, windows, high ground. Nobody expects danger from the forest floor, because nobody has ever been on the forest floor. Until now. At 7 p.m., full dark, Frank crawled backward out of the position. It took him 10 minutes to move 20 feet. Careful, silent. When he reached American lines, his uniform was caked in frozen mud. His hands were numb. But Frank knew with absolute certainty that it would work. The question was whether the Army would let him live long enough to prove it. On December 13th, Frank found Captain Whitmore again. Found a position, sir. Whitmore looked at him. Didn't ask for details. Smart man. Radio check every 2 hours. Miss a check, I send a patrol. Understood, sir. Whitmore started to turn away, then stopped. And Callahan, if this works, I never gave permission. If it doesn't work, I definitely never gave permission. Yes, sir. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He thought about Hayes and Briggs and Morrison and Peterson. He thought about the 187 men still alive in the company. He thought about Linda in the yellow dress waiting for a letter that would never come. He thought about court-martial firing squads, stockade. He thought about Uncle Sean and deer hunting and patience. Worth the risk. At 4:30 a.m. on December 14th, Frank gathered his gear. Springfield rifle, 300 rounds in a canvas bag, every piece of cold weather gear the Army issued, wool sweater, field jacket, overcoat. He knew it wouldn't be enough. Ground level in December meant hypothermia in 4 hours. If the Germans didn't kill him, the cold would. Frank moved into position in complete darkness, navigating by memory. He crawled under the fallen oak, dragging his rifle and ammunition. He packed snow into the gaps around his body to eliminate any silhouette. Then he settled in and waited. The moisture started seeping through his clothing immediately. No movement meant no heat generation. His core temperature would drop. Steadily, inevitably. Frank had accepted this. Staying warm meant staying alive, but moving meant dying. He'd made his choice. Dawn came slowly. Black to gray to dim winter light filtering through the forest canopy. At 6:15 a.m., a German soldier walked past 220 yards out smoking a cigarette. Frank watched him through the scope. Finger off the trigger. Not yet. The German finished his cigarette and moved on, unaware he'd just been in a sniper's crosshairs. At 7:23 a.m., the German MG-42 opened fire somewhere east of Frank's position. He heard American voices shouting. His platoon was pinned down. German voices calling in the distance. Movement through the trees. 3 soldiers advancing. Frank centered his crosshairs on the lead German. This was it. In the next 4 hours, Frank Callahan would kill 18 Germans, save 40 American lives, and prove that one working-class kid from South Boston understood forest warfare better than every West Point graduate in the European theater. The Army would give him 30 days in the stockade for it. But first he had to survive the coldest, deadliest 4 hours of his life. Frank had approximately 4 hours before hypothermia killed him. The Germans advancing on his platoon had approximately 45 minutes before Frank Callahan made them disappear. Neither side knew the other's deadline. Before Frank engaged, he could see 3 specific American soldiers pinned down 200 yards behind him. He knew their names, he knew their stories, and he knew that if he did nothing in 30 minutes, all 3 would be dead. Private Danny Collins from Boston, 22 years old dock worker, like Frank's father. Collins had twin daughters back home, Yanni and Rose, age 6. He kept their photo in his helmet, updated it every month when his wife sent new pictures. That morning, Collins had shown Frank the latest one. Both girls in matching dresses, gap-toothed smiles. Look how big they're getting, Callahan. They'll be in first grade when I get home. Collins had 17 days until rotation. 17 days until he could hold his daughters again. Frank could see Collins, now pinned behind a fallen log German machine gun, fire tearing the bark above his head. Private First Class Tony Rizzo from Brooklyn, 19 years old. The kid wrote poetry, unusual for infantry. He carried a small notebook in his chest pocket, wrote between combat during those quiet moments when death wasn't actively trying to find you. Rizzo's hands shook before firefights. Not from cowardice, just sensitivity. The kind of soul that felt everything too deeply. Once he'd read Frank a poem he'd written. If I die here in this frozen wood, tell my mother I died brave and good. Frank had just nodded, not knowing what to say. Frank could see Rizzo now curled behind a tree, clutching his rifle, terrified but steady. Corporal James Wilson from Tennessee, 24 years old, married 6 months before deployment. His wife's name was Sarah. Wilson kept a calendar, crossed off each day, in pencil, counting down. 21 days until rotation. 21 days until he could drink Tennessee bourbon on his own front porch. Wilson talked about that bourbon constantly, like it was a talisman, something to keep him alive. The promise of something good waiting at the end of all this death. Frank could see Wilson now shouting orders to his squad, keeping them alive through sheer force of will. 3 men, 3 families, Collins's twins, Rizzo's mother, Wilson's wife. If Frank did nothing, the German advance would overrun their position in 30 minutes. If Frank did something in 30 minutes, he might be dead or court-martialed. But they would be alive. Hayes couldn't be alive. But they could. What Frank didn't know was that by the end of this day, all three men would survive, and one of them would later save Frank's life in a way Frank never expected. Frank had already killed the first German. Lead soldier 180 yards. The other two had scattered, searching for the shooter, looking everywhere except down. Now Frank worked the bolt. The spent casing ejected bounced off the log, underside landed in the mud beside his face. The brass was hot, melting the snow it touched. He chambered a new round. The metallic snick was quiet but definite. The second German was crouched behind a tree 30 yards from where his comrade had fallen. Smart, using cover, but he was still searching, scanning the tree line, trying to spot the sniper. He didn't understand yet that the threat wasn't above him. Frank centered the crosshairs on the German's chest, high just below the throat. Squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against his shoulder. The sound was enormous. The German pitched backward, arms wide, clutching at his chest. Blood sprayed across the white snow. Bright red, impossibly bright. He was dead before he hit the ground. The third German broke and ran. Smart. Survival instinct overriding training. He zigzagged through the trees, heading back toward German lines. Frank tracked him through the scope, leading the movement, accounting for the angle. He fired, missed. The first miss of the day. The German disappeared into heavy undergrowth. Frank didn't chase him with another shot. Let him go. Let him tell his commander what happened. Let him spread fear and conserve ammunition. The MG-42 had stopped firing. Silence spread through the forest like spilled water. The kind of silence that felt dangerous. Frank lay motionless, controlling his breathing. His ears rang from the muzzle blasts. His shoulder ached where the recoil had hammered into frozen ground. The smell of gunpowder hung in the confined space under the log. Sharp, acrid. The smell of violence. Minutes passed. Nothing moved. Then Frank saw them. 4 German soldiers advancing in a line 50 yards apart. Moving cautiously now, weapons up, checking every tree, every shadow, every potential hide. They knew there was a sniper. They knew he was effective. They just didn't know where, and that not knowing was killing them. Fear does more damage than bullets sometimes. Frank let them come closer. Patience, the leftmost soldier was 140 yards out. The rightmost was nearly 200. Frank selected his targets. Closest first. Always closest first. He fired. The leftmost soldier dropped like someone had cut his strings. The other 3 hit the dirt immediately, professional. Returning fire blindly. Rounds smacked into trees, tore through undergrowth, kicked up snow. The sound was enormous. Maybe 50, 60 rounds in the first 10 seconds. But none came close to Frank's position. They were aiming too high, aiming where American snipers should be. 5 feet up, 6 feet, into the branches, into the canopy. Not down, never down. Frank worked the bolt, chambered another round. The second German from the left was low crawling toward cover, trying to get behind a thick oak. Frank tracked him through the scope. The German moved well, keeping his profile low using the terrain. But he was visible. Just barely. Just enough. Frank led the movement slightly. Squeezed. The round caught the German in the spine just below the shoulder blades. The man stopped moving immediately. Not dead, probably. Paralyzed. Combat ineffective. Same result. The remaining 2 Germans stopped returning fire. Smart, conserving ammunition, trying to spot the shooter. One of them low crawled backward, retreating. The other stayed frozen behind a tree weapon, ready, waiting. Frank watched the frozen one, patience. The German didn't move for 10 seconds. 20, 30. A minute passed. The cold was working its way through Frank's body now. He could feel it in his fingers. A numbness starting in the tips, spreading toward the palms. Not good. Not good at all. But he couldn't move. Movement meant death. 90 seconds. The German shifted slightly, adjusting his position. Just a small movement, trying to get more comfortable behind the tree, trying to ease the strain on his muscles. That small movement was enough. Frank fired. The round punched through the edge of the tree bark, exploding, and caught the German in the neck. He dropped without a sound. The 4th German, the one who'd been retreating, broke completely and ran. Frank let him go. 5 Germans down. Time elapsed 17 minutes. Frank's hands were still warm. The platoon was still pinned. 12 more kills to go. Frank keyed his radio voice low. Callahan to Whitmore, 5 confirmed, no contact on my position. Silence on the radio, then Whitmore's voice tight with something Frank couldn't identify. Shock maybe, or fear. Jesus Christ, Callahan, where the hell are you? Ground level, sir, under a fallen oak. Another pause. You were under a log for 17 minutes. Yes, sir. They can't see you. No, sir. One more pause longer this time. You're insane. I'm alive, sir. They're not. Frank didn't know it, but the German he'd let escape would report to his commander within the hour. American sniper, unknown position, impossible accuracy, and in 15 minutes the Germans would send their best counter-sniper team to find Frank. They would almost succeed. At 8:20 a.m., the MG-42 opened fire again. Long, sustained burst. Disciplined, professional. The German gunner was good, keeping the American platoon pinned while infantry maneuvered. Frank heard American voices shouting, calling for suppression, for smoke, for anything that would give them room to move. 2 German soldiers ran forward to support the machine gun position. Fast movers, experienced, using the covering fire to close distance. 170 yards out, 185. Frank tracked the first runner through his scope. The German was moving in short bursts, 3 steps drop, 3 more steps. Good tactics, but predictable after you watched it twice. Frank waited for the pattern. 3 steps, drop, 3 steps. On the 4th burst, Frank squeezed the trigger. The German dropped mid-stride, not from cover, from death. His momentum carried him forward another 2 steps before he fell face first into the snow. Frank worked the bolt. The second runner saw his comrade fall, tried to change direction, zigging instead of zagging. Frank tracked him, led the movement, fired. The round caught him in the hip, spinning him like a top. He went down screaming, clutching the shattered bone. Not dead, but he wouldn't be fighting anymore today. Probably wouldn't be fighting anymore this war. 7 confirmed. The Germans responded with suppressive fire. Maybe 4 or 5 weapons all opening up at once, pouring rounds into the tree line where they thought Frank might be. The sound was incredible, continuous, overwhelming. Bullets snapped overhead, impacted trees, tore through branches. Bark and wood chips rained down. The noise made thinking difficult. Frank pressed himself as flat as possible, listening to death pass 6 feet above him. Some rounds hit his oak log. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Heavy impacts that he felt through the ground. The log shuddered but held. 3 feet of solid oak. It would take a lot more than rifle fire to punch through. The suppressive fire lasted maybe 30 seconds. Felt like 30 minutes. When it stopped, the silence was shocking. Frank's ears were ringing so badly he could barely hear. He waited, watching, patient. At 8:45 a.m., Frank heard voices, German voices, 2 men positioning themselves north of his location, maybe 250 yards out. He couldn't see them directly, but he could hear equipment rattling, low conversation, the specific sounds of men setting up a hide. German counter-sniper team. 1 spotter, 1 shooter. Frank watched the area where he thought they were scanning with his scope, looking for any sign. There. Movement. Just a flicker. The spotter raising binoculars. Then nothing. They'd gone to ground. Professional. Frank tracked where he thought they were. The German shooter would be scanning elevated positions. Crees ridgelines, the blown-out farmhouse to the east. All the places an American sniper should be. They were looking in completely wrong places, but they were thorough, methodical, checking every potential hide within 400 yards. Frank had a shot. Maybe. 230 yards, German spotter partially exposed behind a fallen log. But the angle was bad, low percentage. And if Frank shot and missed, the counter-sniper team would triangulate his position from the muzzle flash and sound. They were good enough to do that. Frank could tell from how they moved. He decided to wait. Let them search. Let them waste time looking in all the wrong places. Patience was a weapon too. For 15 minutes, Frank lay frozen watching the German counter-sniper team work. They were good, really good. Checking every tree, every elevation, working a grid pattern. Perfect professional technique. Completely wrong assumption. They never once looked down. never considered that an American sniper might be on the forest floor. It wasn't in their doctrine either. At 9:30 a.m., the Germans gave up. Frank heard equipment being packed, low conversation. Then nothing. They moved out, heading back toward their own lines. Frustrated, probably. Confused. How do you fight a ghost? Frank exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized he'd been holding tension in his shoulders. The German counter-sniper team was the most dangerous thing he'd faced all morning. More dangerous than the infantry, more dangerous than the machine gun. Because they knew how to look. They just didn't know where. At 9:05 a.m., 3 more Germans attempted a flanking maneuver, coming from the right, trying to get around the American position. Loose formation, good tactics, using cover effectively. The lead man was 210 yards out, long shot through undergrowth. Frank adjusted for distance, led the target, slightly squeezed the trigger. The German dropped instantly. The other 2 scattered, diving behind trees. Frank scanned, watching, waiting for one of them to move. 30 seconds passed, 1 minute. Finally, one of the Germans shifted position, trying to get a better angle. Frank saw the movement through a gap in the brush. Fired. The round hit the German in the shoulder high, spinning him around. He went down screaming. The last German stayed behind his tree. Smart man, he didn't move for 5 minutes. 10. Patient, disciplined, waiting for Frank to give away his position. But Frank was more patient. 11 years of patience, learned hunting deer with Uncle Sean. At 9:15, the German shifted slightly, just adjusting his stance, trying to ease the strain on his legs. That tiny movement was enough. Frank fired. The round punched through the edge of the tree and caught the German in the neck. He dropped without a sound. 10 confirmed. Frank keyed his radio. Callahan, 10 confirmed. Whitmore's voice came back immediately. Status? They're checking low positions now, sir. Getting closer. Can you extract? Negative. Platoon still pinned. Need to finish this. A pause, then Whitmore's voice quieter. Understood. Stay alive, Callahan. What Frank didn't know was that in the next 30 minutes, he would face the 2 deadliest threats of the day. German mortar fire that would nearly kill him, and hypothermia that was slowly stealing his ability to shoot. He would survive both. Barely. At 9:20 a.m., a German patrol swept directly through Frank's area. 6 soldiers, systematic, professional. And they were checking fallen logs. They'd adapted to Frank's tactic. This was very bad. Frank lay absolutely frozen. His heart hammered. He forced it to slow, forced his breathing to shallow, forced every muscle to relax. Any tension would cause micro-movements. Any movement meant detection. Any detection meant death. The patrol approached. Frank could hear boots crunching in the snow, equipment rattling, low voices speaking German. They were 50 feet away, 40, 30. 2 of them walked directly toward Frank's oak log. 20 feet away. Frank could hear their breathing, could hear one of them coughing, could hear fabric rustling as they moved. 10 feet away, they stopped. One of them said something in German, the other responded. Frank didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. Casual, not alert. They were checking the log because it was in their search pattern, not because they suspected anything. They stood there for 90 seconds. Frank didn't breathe. His lungs burned. His vision started to tunnel, black creeping in from the edges. Not yet, not yet. Hold it, hold it. One of the Germans said something. Next here, nothing here. They moved on, continuing their sweep east. Frank waited 5 full minutes before he allowed himself to breathe normally. His hands were shaking, not from cold, from adrenaline, from the knowledge that he'd been 10 feet from death and death had walked right past him. But now the Germans knew. They knew the sniper was ground level. They just didn't know exactly where. Frank had maybe 30 minutes before they figured it out. Maybe less. At 9:30 a.m., Frank realized his hands were numb, completely numb. He flexed his fingers, watching them move. He could see the movement, but couldn't feel it. This was very bad. He tried to feel the trigger. Nothing, just pressure, no sensation. He'd have to watch his finger move, estimate the 4-pound pull by visual feedback alone. His toes had gone numb 20 minutes ago. His feet were just dead weights at the ends of his legs. And his core temperature was dropping. He could feel it, a coldness spreading from his center outward. Medical reality, his training told him. Core temperature probably 96 degrees. Hypothermia onset. Another hour, maybe 90 minutes, and he'd be combat ineffective. Confused. Unable to make accurate shots. Frank forced the thought away. Collins needs me. Rizzo needs me. Wilson needs me. I can handle cold. Pain is just information. Cold is just information. Hayes felt nothing when he died. I can handle cold. At 9:45 a.m., Frank heard a sound that made his blood run even colder than it already was. Thump, thump, thump. Distant. Mortar tubes firing. 15 seconds later, the first round impacted. Crump. 150 yards east. Crump. The second round, 120 yards east. Crump. The third round, 100 yards east. Walking fire pattern. The Germans were bracketing the area, trying to suppress or kill the sniper. Frank pressed himself as flat as possible. The oak log would provide some protection. Some. Not enough if a round landed close. But moving meant certain death. Staying meant probable death. Frank chose probable. The second bracket came in. Crump. 80 yards east. Crump. 60 yards east. Close enough that Frank felt the concussion. The air pressure changed. His ears popped. Dirt and snow rained down. Crump. 40 yards east. Shrapnel shrieked overhead, tearing through branches. A large branch fell across Frank's oak log with a heavy thud. Frank lay there, not breathing, not moving, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Please. Not a direct hit. Not like Morrison. Please. 10 seconds. 20. 30. No more impacts. The Germans thought they'd suppressed the sniper. Or killed him. Either way, the mortar stopped. Frank checked himself. No shrapnel wounds. The oak log had fresh gouges where shrapnel had hit it. 3 feet of oak. Thank God for trees. His hearing was worse now. The ringing so loud it was almost a physical pain. But he was alive. At 10:05 a.m., after the mortar fire, a German machine gun team tried to reposition. 3 men carrying an MG-42 tripod and ammunition boxes. They were moving fast, using the mortar smoke and dust as concealment, trying to get a better angle on the American platoon. Frank spotted them through the undergrowth, field gray uniforms, the distinctive shape of the MG-42. 195 yards. Target priority gunner first. Always kill the gunner first. Frank's hands were completely numb now. He had to watch his finger move to the trigger. Had to estimate pressure by seeing how much the finger bent. 4 pounds. He thought it was 4 pounds. Hard to tell. He centered the crosshairs on the lead man carrying the machine gun. Squeezed. Watched his finger bend. Felt nothing. The rifle fired. He didn't know exactly when until the recoil hit. The German dropped the MG-42 and fell. The other 2 dove for cover. Frank worked the bolt. The action was stiff now. Cold was affecting the lubricant. He had to muscle it. Chambered around. Fired at one of the Germans trying to crawl toward cover. Missed. The cold was affecting his accuracy. Third shot. The round caught one German in the leg. Not a kill shot, but he was out of the fight, screaming, clutching the shattered bone. The remaining German grabbed the MG-42, trying to drag it to safety. Brave man. Stupid, but brave. Frank worked the bolt again, the action even stiffer. Chambered around. The German was almost to cover. Almost safe. Frank fired. The round hit the German between the shoulder blades. He dropped the weapon and fell forward. The MG-42 lay in the snow, silent, abandoned. 12 confirmed. Frank keyed his radio. His speech would have been slurred if he'd been talking out loud. He could feel it, the cold affecting his motor control. Callahan, 12 confirmed. Whitmore's voice came back sharp. Status affirm, single word. All Frank could manage without his impairment being obvious. Callahan, you sound wrong. You hypothermic? Frank knew better than to lie to Whitmore. Manageable. It wasn't manageable. But what choice did he have? The platoon was still pinned. Collins, Rizzo, Wilson were still in danger. Frank could pass out after. At 10:15 a.m., the American platoon began withdrawing. Fire teams leapfrogging back through the forest, covering each other, professional, disciplined. But it exposed them. German fire intensified. Rifles, machine guns, the occasional mortar round. The noise was constant and overwhelming. Frank's job now was simple. Cover the withdrawal, keep the Germans pinned, keep his friends alive. 5 Germans advanced trying to exploit the American withdrawal. Staggered line, good tactics, veteran unit. The closest was 160 yards out. Frank fired. Hit. The German pitched forward. Frank worked the bolt, fired again. Hit. Another German down. The remaining 3 went prone, returning massive fire. Maybe 20-30 rounds in Frank's general direction. Rounds impacted his oak log. Thunk, 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 thunk. Multiple hits. The log shuddered. Bark exploded. Splinters flew. Some of the rounds punched partially through the 3-foot-thick oak. Not all the way, but deep. Deep enough to be terrifying. Frank pressed absolutely flat, listening to death hammer the log that was keeping him alive. 3 feet of oak. Hold together. Please hold together. The fire stopped. Reloading, probably. Frank ignored the remaining 3 Germans who'd gone prone. Tracked one who was trying to low crawl forward, trying to close distance. 175 yards. Moving target. Difficult shot even with warm hands. Frank's hands were frozen. He centered the crosshairs, watched his finger move to the trigger. Estimated 4 pounds of pressure. Fired. Hit. The German stopped moving. Shoulder wound. Not fatal, but he was done. 15 confirmed. Frank could see Collins, now moving back, bounding from cover to cover, still alive. He could see Rizzo running between trees, notebook, somehow still in his pocket, still alive. He could see Wilson shouting orders, directing his squad's withdrawal, still alive. All 3 still breathing. Frank's job was to keep them that way. At 10:35 a.m., 2 Germans from the flanking element began retreating back toward their own lines. Smart. The attack had stalled. Time to pull back. They were 240 yards out now. Very long shot, moving targets, through undergrowth. Frank's hands were completely numb. His vision was slightly blurred. He could feel it. The hypothermia affecting his eyes, his fine motor control, his judgment. This was the shot that should miss. The shot that was beyond reasonable capability given his condition. But he thought about Collins's twins, Annie and Rose, 6 years old, gap-toothed smiles. He thought about Rizzo's mother waiting for letters. He thought about Wilson's wife Sarah counting days until her husband came home. He thought about Hayes bleeding out in the snow 17 days short of seeing Linda in her yellow dress. Frank centered the crosshairs, 240 yards. The German was moving fast now, heading home. Frank led the target more than usual, adjusted for the extreme range, watched his finger move to the trigger, squeezed. The rifle fired, missed, expected. The range was too far, his condition too degraded. Frank worked the bolt. The action was very sluggish now, the lubricant nearly frozen. He had to force it with muscle, chambered another round. The German was even farther now, 245 yards. The shot was impossible. Frank fired anyway. The German stumbled, fell, didn't get up. The round had caught him high in the back, just below the neck. At 245 yards with frozen hands and blurred vision, Frank shouldn't have made that shot. He couldn't explain how he did. Maybe Hayes was helping. Maybe Morrison. Maybe all the men who died following the manual were guiding his hand. Or maybe it was just luck. The universe evening out the odds for one day. 17 confirmed, 3 more to go. Frank realized he couldn't feel his face. He tried to speak testing. The words came out slurred. This was very bad. Core temperature probably 94, maybe 93 degrees. Moderate hypothermia, bordering on severe. Another stage down and he'd lose consciousness. Not yet. Platoon almost clear. 3 more kills. Then he could pass out. Then he could die if that's what the force wanted. But not yet. At 10:50 a.m., the Germans made one final push. 6 soldiers, aggressive, coordinated, trying to catch the withdrawing Americans. Frank had maybe 40 rounds left. Enough. 2 Germans in the lead, 160 and 175 yards. Frank fired. Hit. The first dropped. He worked the bolt, forced the frozen action chambered around. Fired. Hit. The second fell. 4 Germans remaining. They poured fire at Frank's position. Massive volume. The oak log took dozens of hits. Thunk, 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 thunk. Some rounds punched deep into the oak. The log groaned. Bark and splinters rained down on Frank. One splinter cut his cheek. He felt the sting through the numbness. Blood ran down his face, warm against frozen skin. 3 feet of oak. Hold together. Hold. The fire stopped. Frank scanned through blurred vision. A German squad leader appeared visible, rank insignia pointing toward the American withdrawal route, shouting orders. 185 yards. This had to count. Frank might not get another shot. His body was shutting down. Core temperature probably 93 degrees. Severe hypothermia imminent. Vision tunneling. Thoughts slow. Hands completely useless except as awkward clubs. Frank centered the crosshairs on the squad leader's chest, had to consciously think through each step. Breathe out, watch finger move, estimate 4-pound pull. He couldn't feel anything, just had to trust muscle memory. Trust 11 years of patience. Squeezed. The rifle fired. Through the blurred scope, Frank saw the German's body jerk, saw him fall backward. Hit. The remaining 3 Germans broke, ran back toward their own lines. The attack was over. Stalled. Failed. Frank keyed his radio. His voice was weak. Callahan to Whitmore. 18 confirmed. Enemy advance stalled. Platoon clear. Affirmative. All accounted for. 0 casualties. Callahan, you need to extract now. Copy. Extracting. And Callahan, MPs are coming. I'm sorry. Frank understood. The court-martial was coming whether he lived or died. Whitmore had to protect himself. Had to deny the conversation ever happened. Understood, sir. Worth it. Because Collins was alive. Rizzo was alive. Wilson was alive. 40 men were alive. And that was worth 30 days in a stockade. Worth a reduction in rank. Worth whatever the Army wanted to do to him. Hayes would understand. Now Frank just had to survive long enough to face the consequences. Frank couldn't just stand up and run. Standing meant silhouetting himself against the forest. Standing meant becoming visible. Standing meant dying after everything he'd survived. He had to crawl backward, dragging his rifle and gear, staying below the log line. His legs didn't work right. The cold had locked his muscles into rigid, useless things. He pushed with his elbows, pulled with his forearms, inched backward through the frozen mud. 5 feet per minute, maybe less. His body screamed. Every movement was agony. The cold, the exhaustion, the 4 hours of absolute stillness, all of it had turned his body into something that barely functioned. 10 yards out from the oak log, Frank heard voices. German voices. Close. Too close. He froze. Not breathing. 3 German soldiers appeared through the undergrowth, maybe 40 feet away, heading directly toward his position. No, not his position. His former position. The oak log. They were going to examine it. Frank lay in the open, partially concealed by low brush, in his mud-caked uniform, but visible if anyone looked carefully. If the Germans turned his direction, if they scanned the ground, instead of focusing on the log, they would see him. And he was too weak to fight, too cold to run. He would die here 15 yards from safety because his body had nothing left to give. The 3 Germans reached the oak log. One of them knelt examining the packed snow, the gaps Frank had filled to eliminate his silhouette. Another picked up a spent brass casing, still warm. He said something in German, voice rising with excitement or maybe fear. Here, war Here. He was here. The 3rd German looked at the sight line, the 6-inch gap between trunk and ground on the perfect horizontal field of fire. Understanding dawned on his face. Frank could see it even from 40 feet away. Boden, war oft im Boden. Ground. He was on the ground. They spent 2 full minutes examining Frank's position, picking up more brass casings, counting them, 18 shells, 18 kills, looking through the bombs, seeing what Frank had seen, understanding the genius and the simplicity of it. The American sniper had been invisible because he'd been where no one looked, where doctrine said he couldn't be, where common sense said he shouldn't be. Frank lay frozen in the brush, not breathing, vision tunneling from oxygen deprivation and hypothermia. His heart hammered so hard he thought they must hear it. Black crept in from the edges of his vision. Not yet. Not yet. Hold on. Finally, the Germans moved away, heading back toward their own lines. They assumed Frank had already extracted. Why wouldn't they? No one could survive 4 hours in that position in December. The cold alone would kill you. They were almost right. Frank waited 5 more minutes, making absolutely certain they were gone. Then he continued crawling. 20 yards from the oak log, 25, 30. Each yard took forever. His body was shutting down, prioritizing core functions, abandoning everything else. His extremities were gone. His thinking was clouded. But some deep part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 4 hours of frozen hell, kept his arms moving, kept him crawling toward safety. At 11:25 a.m., Frank emerged from the undergrowth into American lines. 2 sentries saw him first. They raised their weapons, then recognition hit. One of them shouted, "Jesus Christ, it's Callahan!" Frank tried to stand. His legs collapsed. He went down hard, face first in the snow. He couldn't feel the impact. Couldn't feel anything. Hands grabbed him, lifted him. He tried to speak, but his jaw was locked. The cold had frozen the muscles. He could only make sounds. Captain Whitmore appeared, moving fast through the soldiers crowding around. He looked at Frank and his face went pale. "Get him to the aid station. Now." They carried Frank. He watched the trees pass overhead, black branches against gray sky, and thought about haze falling from that pine tree. About how Hayes had seen these same branches. About how the world looked the same whether you were living or dying. The aid station was a dugout covered with a tarp, relatively warm, maybe 40 degrees, felt like a furnace. The medic took one look at Frank and started shouting orders. They stripped off his frozen uniform. The fabric had frozen to his skin in places. It tore away, taking skin with it. Frank didn't feel it, didn't feel anything. The medic wrapped him in every blanket they had, forced hot coffee between his locked jaws. Most of it spilled down his chin, but some got through. The medic took his temperature. Rectal, the only accurate way when someone's this far gone. He read the thermometer, looked at Frank, shook his head. 94.2, another hour you'd be dead, maybe 90 minutes. Frank tried to speak. Couldn't. His body shook violently, uncontrollable shivering. His muscles seizing, trying to generate heat. The medic held the coffee cup for him, forcing more hot liquid into him. After 10 minutes, Frank could move his jaw enough to speak. The words came out slurred, damaged. "T. Collins or Rizzo W. Wilson?" The medic looked confused. Whitmore, standing in the entrance to the dugout, answered. "All three, alive, because of you." Frank closed his eyes. Worth it, all of it, worth it. It took 90 minutes for the shaking to stop. By then, soldiers had crowded around the aid station entrance, trying to see Frank, trying to understand what had happened. "How'd you do it? Where were you? How many did you really get? 18 and really 18. Frank didn't answer, couldn't answer. Just drank coffee and waited for his body to remember how to function. At 1 p.m., Private Danny Collins pushed through the crowd. He looked at Frank and his eyes were wet. "Callahan, you saved our asses out there." Frank managed a weak smile. Couldn't speak yet, but the smile said enough. Collins pulled out the photograph. His twin daughters, Annie and Rose. Gap-toothed smiles. "They're going to meet their dad because of you. You understand that Annie and Rose are going to know their father. Because you froze yourself half to death under a goddamn log." Private First Class Tony Rizzo appeared next. He had his notebook in his hand, the one he always carried. He opened it, showed Frank a page. Fresh ink, a poem written in the last hour. "I wrote this, for you. I'll read it to you later when you can hear it proper." Corporal James Wilson came last. He stood at attention formal and saluted. A private doesn't rate a salute from a corporal, but Wilson held it anyway. "You're the best soldier I ever saw, Callahan. Best hunting I ever fought with. Thank you." Frank tried to speak, managed 2 words. "Stay alive." That was all that mattered. They were alive. Hayes was dead, but they were alive. The trade was worth it. By evening, word had spread through the entire company. Frank Callahan, ground-level sniper, 18 kills, 4 hours, 0 American casualties. By the next morning, soldiers from other companies were asking questions. How'd he do it? Can we learn it? Will it work for us? On December 16th, Private Raymond Fletcher approached Frank. Fletcher was 23, from Kansas farm kid who'd grown up hunting coyotes. He'd heard the story. He wanted details. Frank, still weak but functional, told him, "Find a fallen log with clearance underneath. Check the sight lines. Make sure the root ball provides a backstop. Pack snow around the gaps. Stay motionless. Accept the cold. Be patient. You gonna ask permission? Frank asked. Fletcher shook his head. Same as you, didn't I reckon? On December 18th, Fletcher used a hollow log to ambush a German patrol. 4 kills covered a platoon withdrawal, 0 American casualties. It worked. On December 21st, Corporal James Dalton used a root ball position to eliminate a German machine gun team. The team had pinned his platoon for 6 hours. Dalton ended it in 20 minutes. 3 kills. The technique spread quietly, not through official channels, not through training, just man-to-man, whispered in foxholes shared during the quiet moments between firefights. Callahan figured something out. Ground level, fallen timber. It works. By December 25th, a dozen soldiers in the 28th Division were using variations of Frank's technique. By January, it had spread to other units, other forests. No one ordered it. No manual described it. It just happened the way real innovation happens in war. From necessity, from frustration, from men who refused to die following doctrine that didn't work. On December 23rd, the Germans noticed. An after-action report from Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 275th Infantry Division, captured 2 weeks later, described the problem. American sniper tactics have changed. Fire is now originating from ground-level positions, making counter-sniper operations extremely difficult. Traditional elevated search patterns are ineffective. Recommend increased use of indirect fire and systematic clearing of fallen timber. But by then it was too late. The Americans had adapted faster. By January 1945, forest floor sniper hides were standard practice in the Hürtgen. The German 352nd Volksgrenadier Division reported sniper casualties increased 47% in January compared to December. The Americans were invisible. German doctrine couldn't counter what it couldn't see. Frank Callahan had changed how the U.S. Army fought in forests. He'd saved dozens of lives. Conservative estimates suggested 40 to 70 American soldiers survived that winter because of his technique. The Wehrmacht knew about it. Every American sniper in the European theater would eventually learn it. But Frank never got credit. On February 15, 1945, at 9:30 in the morning, military police came for him. Frank was at battalion headquarters in Luxembourg, just walking out of a briefing when they appeared. 2 MPs, 1 sergeant, 1 corporal. The sergeant's face was professionally blank. Private First Class Frank Callahan. Yes, Sergeant. You're under arrest. Unauthorized modification of sniper doctrine, violation of Field Manual 2310, conduct unbecoming a soldier. You need to come with us. Frank didn't resist. He'd known this was coming since December 14th. Known it the moment he crawled under that oak log. Known it when Whitmore said, I never authorized this conversation. The only question had been when, not if. The MPs cuffed him. Unnecessary but procedure. Soldiers in the headquarters area stopped to watch. Some of them knew Frank, knew what he'd done. Private Fletcher was there, the soldier who'd used Frank's technique to kill 4 Germans. Fletcher shouted, "What the hell? He saved our lives." The MP sergeant didn't respond, just guided Frank toward the waiting jeep. Professional, following orders, doing his job. The ride to the division's stockade took 40 minutes. Frank sat in the back, cuffed, watching the Belgian countryside pass. Snow covered everything. Made it look peaceful. Like the war wasn't happening. Like men weren't dying in those beautiful white forests. The MP Corporal Younger, maybe 22, broke the silence. What did you do? Killed 18 Germans. That's good, right? Used the wrong technique. The corporal looked confused. There's a wrong way to kill Nazis. The MP sergeant cut in, voice sharp. Shut it, Reynolds. They drove the rest of the way in silence. The division stockade was a stone building, old, damp, cold. They put Frank in a cell. 8 by 10 feet, cot bucket, barred window. He sat on the cot and waited. No anger, no fear, just acceptance. Hayes was still dead. Collins was still alive. The trade was worth whatever came next. On February 16th, Captain Whitmore visited. He came in civilian clothes, off duty, standing outside Frank's cell with his hands in his pockets. They looked at each other for a long moment. They're charging you with willful disregard of established doctrine. Yes, sir. I testified yesterday. Had to say I never authorized ground-level positioning. I know, sir. Fletcher got 6 more kills last week. Dalton got 3. Your technique works, Callahan. Everyone knows it works. But it's not in the manual. Not yet. Maybe after the war. Frank shrugged. Doesn't matter to me, sir. Whitmore studied him. You really don't care, do you? I care about Hayes, sir, and Briggs and Morrison and Peterson. I care that they died following rules that didn't work. If I can stop that from happening to someone else, I don't care what the Army does to me. Whitmore nodded slowly. Then he said something Frank would remember for the rest of his life. For what it's worth, you did the right thing. Tell that to the court, sir. Whitmore smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I did. Didn't help. The court-martial convened on February 19th at division headquarters. 3 officers sat in judgment. Colonel Marcus Henderson, 48 years old, West Point, class of 1919. He'd never seen the Hürtgen, never fought in dense forest. His combat experience was North Africa, open desert, clear sight lines. Major Paul Crenshaw, 41 logistics officer, good at moving supplies, never fired a shot in anger. Captain David Mills, 34 artillery. He killed from miles away with math and radio calls. None of them understood what Frank had done. None of them had watched Hayes die. None of them had felt the cold seeping through their body while German machine gun fire tore the air above them. The gallery held maybe 20 soldiers. Fletcher was there. Dalton. Others who'd used Frank's technique. Others whose lives Frank had saved. They watched in silence as the charges were read. Private First Class Frank Callahan, you are accused of willfully disregarding established sniper procedure as outlined in Field Manual 2310, endangering yourself and your unit through reckless tactical decisions and undermining military discipline by encouraging other soldiers to violate training standards. How do you plead? Frank stood. Guilty, sir. A murmur ran through the gallery. The colonel blinked, surprised. You admit to these charges? Yes, sir. I violated the manual. I used ground-level positions. I told other men how to do it. Major Crenshaw leaned forward. Do you understand that sniper doctrine exists to maximize effectiveness while minimizing risk? I understand the doctrine got men killed, sir. Hayes, Briggs, Morrison, Peterson, all dead because they followed the manual. The manual has been developed over years of combat experience. Frank interrupted, voice calm but firm. Not forest combat, sir. Not the Hürtgen. That manual was written for open terrain. The forest's different. Captain Mills spoke up. Even if your tactic was effective, you had no authority to make that decision. You're a private. You follow orders. I followed Captain Whitmore's orders, sir. He told me not to get caught and not to miss. I didn't miss. The colonel's jaw tightened. Captain Whitmore denies giving you any such order. Frank nodded. Yes, sir. He has to. Silence filled the room. The 3 officers exchanged glances. They knew. Everyone knew. Whitmore had given Frank permission without giving him permission. Plausible deniability. The Army's favorite game. Captain Whitmore testified. Under oath, he denied everything. Denied the conversation. Denied giving Frank authorization. Denied even knowing about the technique until after December 14th. His face was blank professional. He was protecting his career. Frank understood. No resentment, no anger. Whitmore had done what he had to do. Private Fletcher testified. Sir Private Callahan taught me his technique. December 18th, I used it. 4 kills covered platoon withdrawal. I'm alive because of Frank Callahan. So are 10 other men. So you knowingly violated doctrine? Yes, sir, and I'd do it again. The manual was killing us. Frank Callahan saved us. Corporal Dalton testified. Used the technique December 21st. Eliminated a machine gun team. Freed a platoon that had been pinned for 6 hours. Frank Callahan's tactic works, sir. In the Hürtgen, it works better than the manual. But doctrine was developed by experienced officers. Respectfully, sir, those officers never fought in the Hürtgen. Frank Callahan did. He watched his friends die following their rules. He figured out something better. Finally, they let Frank speak. He stood before the 3 officers and told them everything. About growing up in South Boston, about his father working the docks, about deer hunting with Uncle Sean, about Hayes and Linda in the yellow dress, about watching good men die following doctrine that didn't work, about lying under that oak log for 4 hours freezing, fighting killing 18 Germans while his body shut down from hypothermia. I didn't want to violate doctrine, sirs. I wanted to stop watching my friends die. So I used what I learned hunting deer. I stayed low. I killed 18 Germans in 4 hours without taking return fire. Then Fletcher used it, Dalton used it, others used it, and we stopped losing snipers. I know I broke the rules, but Hayes is still dead. Following the rules didn't save him. Breaking them saved Fletcher. I'll take 30 days in the stockade if it means one less mother gets a telegram about her son. The three officers deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, Colonel Henderson's face was unreadable. Private First Class Frank Callahan, this court finds you guilty of all charges. We recognize that your actions resulted in significant enemy casualties and arguably protected American lives. However, military discipline cannot be maintained if soldiers unilaterally disregard established doctrine regardless of outcome. This court sentences you to reduction in rank to private 30 days confinement in division stockade and forfeiture of 1 month's pay. This sentence serves as a warning to others who might consider similar violations. Dismissed. Frank stood at attention. Yes, sir. The gallery erupted, soldiers shouting, bullshit. He saved our lives. You're punishing a hero. The MPs moved in, restoring order, clearing the room. As they led Frank out, Fletcher grabbed his arm. We'll remember, Frank. We'll remember what you did. Frank served his 30 days. The stockade was cold, damp, miserable. Bad food, hard cot, nothing to do but think. He thought about Hayes, about Collins's daughters, about Rizzo's poetry, about Wilson's Tennessee bourbon, about 40 men who went home because Frank had broken the rules. Worth it. Every day of it, worth it. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Frank was at a replacement depot in Belgium, effectively sidelined for the duration. He heard the news, heard soldiers celebrating, drinking, crying, laughing. He sat alone and thought about Hayes, who never got to see this day. About Linda in the yellow dress, still waiting for a letter that would never come. Frank shipped home in August. Troop ship from Le Havre to Boston. 8 days at sea. He stood on deck watching the ocean, thinking about everything that had happened, everything he'd done, everything it had cost. His father met him at the dock on August 23, 1945. They shook hands. Frank Callahan looked older. The war had aged everyone, even those who stayed home. You all right, Frank? Yeah, Dad, I'm all right. They walked home through South Boston. The streets looked exactly the same. Row houses, corner stores. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Frank went back to Bethlehem Steel for 3 years. Same job. Riveting hulls. In 1988, he opened an auto repair shop 3 blocks from where he grew up. Callahan's Auto Repair. He was good at it. Patient, thorough, honest. People trusted him. In 1952, he married Dorothy O'Malley. She worked at Woolworths on Market Street. Quiet woman. Kind. They had 2 children. Margaret in 1953. Patrick Jr. in 1956. Bought a house in Dorchester. Frank coached Little League. Fixed neighborhood kids' bicycles for free. Went to church every Sunday, though he never took communion. The guilt about killing, even justified killing, never quite left him. People ask sometimes. Customers, neighbors. You serve, yeah. Infantry. That was all he'd say. He never mentioned the Hürtgen, never mentioned 18 kills, never mentioned the court-martial, never mentioned any of it. In 1957, the U.S. Army published an updated edition of Field Manual 23-10, Chapter 6. Section 4 included a new subsection. Employment of ground-level concealment in forest terrain. The manual described the use of fallen timber, root balls, and natural depressions as sniper hides in dense woodland. It cited effectiveness studies from the Hürtgen Forest Campaign and recommended the technique for situations where traditional elevated positions were untenable. The manual did not mention Frank Callahan. Frank never knew about the update. He didn't follow military publications, didn't go to veteran reunions, didn't talk about the war. He fixed cars, raised his kids, lived quietly. That was enough. On November 11, 1973, Frank attended a Veterans Day ceremony in Philadelphia. He stood in the crowd, hands in pockets, while politicians gave speeches about sacrifice and service. After the ceremony, an older man approached him, wearing an infantry veteran cap. "You Frank Callahan?" "Yeah, James Dalton. I was in the 110th Company C. We used your technique in the Hürtgen." Frank nodded. He remembered the name. "I wanted to say thank you. You saved my life. Probably saved a lot of lives." Frank looked uncomfortable. "Just did what needed doing." "You got court-martialed for it. That's more than doing what needed doing. That's courage." Frank shook his head. Courage was Hayes climbing that tree, knowing it might kill him. "I just figured out a better way." Dalton smiled. "That's what courage looks like in war, Frank. Not the dramatic stuff, the quiet decisions." They shook hands. Frank never saw him again. Frank Callahan died on March 8, 1989, 67 years old. Heart attack while working under a customer's Chevy. Massive, instant. He died the way he'd lived. Quietly, doing his job, not asking for recognition. His obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer ran 4 paragraphs. Frank Callahan, 67, died March 8th. Owner of Callahan's Auto Repair for 41 years. Survived by wife Dorothy, daughter Margaret, son Patrick Jr., 4 grandchildren. Army veteran, World War II. Services, Saturday St. Augustine's Church. It didn't mention the Bronze Star recommendation that was never processed. Didn't mention the Hürtgen forest. Didn't mention 18 dead Germans or a court-martial or the technique that changed sniper doctrine. Just 4 paragraphs. A life reduced to basics. His funeral was well attended, neighbors, customers, family. A VFW color guard fired a salute. 7 rifles, 3 volleys. They folded the flag and gave it to Dorothy. Frank was buried in a veteran's cemetery outside Boston. 1 white marble headstone among thousands. Frank Callahan, Private U.S. Army, 1922-1989. In 1994, a military historian named Dr. Margaret Holloway was researching sniper tactics in the European theater. She found references in German after-action reports to American ground-level sniper positions in the Hürtgen forest. She cross-referenced American records, found Captain Whitmore's unit reports from December 1944, discovered the 18 confirmed kills on December 14th, traced it back to Frank Callahan, found the court-martial transcript. In '96, Dr. Holloway published her findings in the Journal of Military History. The article was titled "Tactical Innovation at the Individual Level, the Forest Floor Sniper Hide in the Hürtgen Forest Campaign." It described Frank's technique in detail, analyzed its effectiveness, traced its adoption throughout the American infantry. The article concluded that Frank Callahan's unauthorized tactical innovation had saved an estimated 40 to 70 American lives during the winter of 1944 to 1945. Nobody read it except other historians. In 2003, the Army Special Operations Sniper Course added forest floor concealment techniques to their curriculum. Instructors taught students to use fallen timber root balls and ground depressions as hide sites in woodland environments. The technique was considered standard doctrine by 2005. Training manuals credited field innovations during World War II without naming individuals. Frank Callahan's name appeared in none of these documents. Today, if you visit Frank's grave in the Veterans Cemetery outside Boston, you'll see a standard white marble headstone. It lists his name, his rank, private, not private, first class, his dates of service, and his death date. It doesn't mention his Bronze Star recommendation. It doesn't mention the Hürtgen forest. It doesn't mention anything except the bare facts of his existence. But in forests around the world, snipers still use the technique Frank invented under a fallen oak tree on December 14, 1944. They position themselves at ground level, invisible in the undergrowth, waiting with the patience Frank learned hunting deer in the Berkshire Mountains. They don't know his name. They don't know his story. They just know the technique works. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through engineering studies or committee decisions or revised doctrine. Through enlisted men like Frank Callahan who watch their friends die and refuse to accept it, who violate the manual because the manual is wrong, who risk court-martial because some things matter more than regulations. Hayes mattered. Briggs mattered. Morrison and Peterson mattered. Collins and Rizzo and Wilson mattered. And Frank Callahan, working alone in the frozen mud, figured out how to keep them alive. The Army gave him 30 days in the stockade for it. History didn't give him anything at all, but Danny Collins made it home. His daughters Annie and Rose knew their father. Collins walked Annie down the aisle at her wedding, met his grandchildren, all because of a Marine he fought beside for 6 weeks in a frozen forest. Tony Rizzo published 2 poetry books, 1952 and 1959. He dedicated the second one to unknown heroes who saved my life. One poem was called The Forest Ghost. It was about Frank, though Rizzo never used his name. James Wilson drank his Tennessee bourbon, married Sarah, had 6 children, died in 2001 at age 79. His last words to his family were, "Find Frank Callahan's people. Tell them thank you." In 2003, Annie Collins attended the Marine Corps Museum exhibit on Hürtgen forest tactics. She was 65 years old. She saw a description of the ground-level sniper technique. She asked the curator if this was about Frank Callahan. The curator was surprised anyone knew the name. Annie told him her father had served with Frank, had been saved by him, had come home because of him. "My father walked me down the aisle," Annie said. "He met my children. He lived to be 76 years old, all because of a Marine I never met using a technique he invented for nothing but patience and courage. I wish I could have thanked him." The curator gave her Dr. Holloway's contact information. In 2004, Annie visited Dorothy Callahan, Frank's widow. They sat in Dorothy's kitchen and cried together. For Frank, for all the men who came home, for all the men who didn't. Frank would say it wasn't about him. It was about them, about Hayes and Collins and all the others, about doing the right thing regardless of consequences, about saving lives even if it cost everything. He'd be right, but the lives he saved remember. The families remember. The children who knew their fathers remember. The grandchildren who exist because a working-class kid from South Boston refused to watch his friends die remember. History might have forgotten Frank Callahan, but the people who mattered never did. In forests around the world, when snipers lie on the cold ground invisible and patient waiting for the moment to act, they're using Frank's gift, a gift that cost him his rank, his recognition, his place in history, a gift he gave freely because some things matter more than glory. 40 men lived on December 14, 1944, because Frank Callahan broke the rules. Thousands more lived in the years that followed because his technique spread like wildfire through an army that desperately needed it. The army called it innovation. Frank called it common sense. Hayes would have called it salvation. Frank Callahan, Private U.S. Army, 1922 to 1989, 18 enemy killed, 40 lives saved, court-martialed, forgotten, but not by everyone, never by everyone.